Alright, time for another update and forecast on the park fire. Just wanted to do a brief update this afternoon because peak of fire activity is usually between about 2 and 5 p.m. And just looking at the fire right now, you can see that there is some heat on it when I click this button right there. Those red boxes are going to be where some of the current heat detections are. So that right off the bat tells you kind of where the fire is more active. As expected, it's that northeasterly side of the fire because we have those southwesterly winds today. But as you'll see, the winds aren't that strong, so that's why we're not seeing nearly as much activity as yesterday, and especially not as much activity as what we were seeing last week. So one good way to kind of get the wide view of what's going on there. I mean, I don't want to downplay what's going on because anytime you see that much smoke coming off of a fire, it's certainly active, but it's just not taking off like what we've seen in previous days, and that shows the smoke. Interesting how it almost looks like it's moving to the east. That goes along with what we were talking about earlier about that there was going to be a bit more westerly in the wind today. And then if we zoom in here, that's also where you can see that that northeastern section does have some activity where you see the orange, but it doesn't look like it's moving very much. So while it's burning hot, we're not seeing it like rip off to the northeast like we had been seeing in previous days where it was moving 4,000 to 5,000 acres per hour. So just kind of looking at the perimeter here, just getting our bearings, just in case anyone's not familiar with the area. You have Chico down here, Paradise, Magalia, Butte Meadows, that's one of the places that we'll be talking about throughout the course of this video, and then also Manton and Shingletown up to the north here, and then Mineral over towards the northeast. So I think maybe we'll just get the southwestern and the southern section of the fire out of the way, because on this map, where you see those yellow stars, that's where there's been some heat more than 24 hours ago. Red stars, that's heat within the last 12 hours. And you notice that whole southern side of the fire has no stars whatsoever. So not much heat there. So when we look at the communities, this is looking at structures now in places like Chico, Paradise, Magalia. They're in a pretty good position right now. That's one of the benefits of all the more southerly winds we've had recently. It's pushed this fire up towards the north. And looking at how big the fire is, it did push the fire up around 40 miles. And our most recent numbers for the park fire are showing 386,000 acres, which does make it the 5th largest wildfire in California history. I was just listening to the briefing and they did mention something interesting. It's the 2nd largest California wildfire in history that was a single ignition. The August complex, the Mendocino complex, and the SCU Lightning complex were actually multiple fires that then came together. Whereas if you're just talking about a single ignition, in this case it was arson, Dixie's number 1, and then Park Fire would be number 2. And then structures, we've seen that come up in previous days up to 192. It's not because more structures were destroyed, but it's just they've been doing more inspections. And that was something that was interesting that they talked about in the briefing, is they said that 76% of the structures that they inspected actually survived. So a 76% survival rate is pretty amazing, because when you look at this fire perimeter in the community of Cohasset here, I mean, when that was first happening, it'd be tempting to think, oh, just everything within there has been burnt out. But even within that, you can see that unburned island right there. And then it sounds like 76, I don't know how many of these structures they've inspected, but of the ones that they have inspected, 76 have survived. And they attributed that to maybe 2 different things. One is the great defensible space that Butte County has been doing. And that does make a huge difference. It also helps them out a lot because it just makes their job easier when they go in there to do structure protection. The structure's already in a pretty good position if you've been creating defensible space. And then also just sometimes luck. Mother Nature, sometimes it can just be completely random which structures get destroyed and which ones don't. And then you could also say luck for that cool down that we had over this last weekend. So looking at the map, definitely some heat on the northeastern side. Maybe we'll go over to Butte Meadows first, because that was the place I was the most concerned about this morning. But I would say, even though it looks like there's some heat coming off of the fire very close to Butte Meadows, I'm actually feeling pretty confident about that part of the fire. If we come over to this map, remember this morning, that firing operation wasn't tying into the previous fire perimeter. So we had this little gap right here. And what we were kind of nervous about is that the fire would be able to just come right up into that gap, jump over 32, and then go into Butte Meadows right here where we do have some structures. But it looks like they were able to complete that firing operation that they were talking about. And we also had some of that gap fill in yesterday. That's where we saw some of the heat coming off of yesterday. So now it looks like we have this, basically this area where all of these fuels have been burnt out. So then if this part of the fire does get more active, there's not going to be some fuel to allow that fire to continue. It would require maybe a spot fire to jump over 32, establish here, and then become more active. But the winds haven't been that strong today, and they're not going to be all that strong maybe over the next few days because we have a big high moving in. So Butte Meadows looks like they're in a lot better position than before. Notice it is just hugging right along 32. So amazing that they've been able to hold it there. We did have that one slop over 32 just around, let's see, Humboldt Road. And it sounds like this is some difficult terrain, a lot of fuel in this area. And there's still some heat coming off of this portion of the fire. But whenever things flare up, it sounds like they jump on it right away. So Butte Meadows was my top concern. It maybe still is just because of how close it is, but I'd say we're looking pretty good right there. The other concern that we were talking about this morning was mineral up here because the northeastern section of the fire, as you can clearly see on this imagery, is where most of that heat is coming off of the fire. And in this northeastern section, if we look at fire history, there's a lot of fuels that haven't burnt out in a very long time. And then on top of that, the winds this afternoon were coming more southwesterly. So then that would be able to take some of that heat and then push it up towards mineral, which you see up there. But I would say the good news is doesn't look like there's that much heat coming off of the fire, and it doesn't look like it's spreading that quickly towards the northeast. I think the main reason for that is the winds just aren't all that strong today. You look at the red values on a lot of these weather stations on the ground, and it's showing 5 to 10 miles per hour. Last Thursday, Friday, these were showing around 25 to 30 miles per hour. So there's a lot of factors that play into wildfire growth, and even on this fire, we've seen tons of different factors come into play. Topography, a wet winter leading to abundant grass growth, which then dries out very quickly. We had the heat wave at the beginning of July, which dried out the fuels even more. We have a lack of fire history, so there's a lot of fuels, or there were a lot of fuels in this area that hadn't burned out in a very long time. And then the fire weather forecast last week was very tricky. It was hot, it was dry, and the biggest factor, I would say, were those strong southerly wind gusts that we had for maybe 3 or 4 days straight, which just quickly moved this fire to the north. But now it looks like the winds, which were the biggest factor, I'd say, last week, those winds have calmed down, so we're seeing less activity here. On top of that, the resources assigned to this incident are just amazing. 5,500 personnel, almost 500 engines, 41 helicopters. In my experience forecasting wildfires, I think I've been doing this about 5 years now, and it seems like there's a point at where there's, once you see this many resources show up to a fire, and this might be the most resources I've ever seen on a fire, but once you see that many resources, it's usually a bit more rare for the fire to just take off. So that's one thing that's been helping limit growth over the last few days. The other thing is the improvement in the weather conditions, that it certainly helped that it cooled down and a bit more moisture moved in over the last couple of days, and then we've had those winds really calming down overnight as well. That's what allowed them to, for example, do this firing operation, which now looks like it's protecting Butte Meadows fairly well. So with mineral, just kind of concluding this thought up here, I would say that's maybe shifting into my top concern just because there is a lot of fuel. That is still a very active part of the fire. But, I mean, if we measure this out, that's 7 miles. And with the kind of winds that we have today, the kind of winds we have tomorrow, don't think minerals in any immediate threat in the foreseeable future. We'll maybe see how things change over the next few days, but looking a lot better there. And then on this northern side of the fire, actually before we go to the north, we can actually just look at one video from the eastern side of the fire. So this is looking from Colby Mountain. This is looking kind of at the fire from the east. And you notice that the smoke is coming directly at the camera. That tells you that the winds were a bit more westerly today. So that's why a lot of the growth on the fire today has been on the eastern side, and especially the northeastern side, because that's where we had more of the heat this morning, and then the winds are able to kind of push those flames forward. Overall, though, that doesn't look nearly as bad as what we have seen in previous days. I mean, you think about some of the imagery from last week when you had those giant rotating columns. That's very little compared to that. So now let's go up to the northern side, because, I mean, we didn't have a lot of heat on here showing up this morning, but we did have that spot fire yesterday. Actually, a number of spot fires yesterday. And it is now showing up on the most recent fire perimeter right here, where it went over Lanes Valley Road. And it did go from about, I believe it went from maybe 20 acres to 200 or 300 acres. But then they were able to just blast it with air attack. If we look at watch duty, they still have a bunch of air attack on it right now. And if we zoom way in there, you can actually see the path that those helicopters have been taking, just right where that spot fire was yesterday. And then if we look at the imagery, this is going to be the last 3 hours looking from Inskip Hill kind of towards Cohasset, or not Cohasset, but Shingletown and Manton would be up towards the north here. This is where we did have a decent smoke plume coming off of it yesterday when that spot fire first started and started to pick up steam. But, I mean, that's very little smoke coming off of it right now, and it looks like they're just blasting it with air attack once again. So not expecting that to be of any real concern anytime soon. Looks like there is a little flare up on the west here again, but the winds are a bit more southerly on the western side of the fire, so that would actually push the fire just towards the north. Whereas, so it's not immediately threatening any structures on the western side right there. And then one thing I should say, see these orange dots in here? People might be concerned about those because you have some structures just basically in the path of this fire where the southwesterly winds would try to push it towards those orange dots. But it sounds like they have been actually going into some of these areas and preparing these structures for if the fire came through. And then they also have what you'd call contingency lines just in case like worst case scenarios happen. They've been setting up lines to basically catch this fire, and it looks like we're in a pretty good situation right now overall, even though we do still have a lot of heat coming off of it right there, even though you can see that orange, some smoke, much better than previous days. So now I guess the question would be what's it going to do tomorrow? And it looks like we have pretty similar conditions to what we had today. Slightly warmer, maybe up to 90 in some places. Relative humidity, once again, should be around 20 to 25%. So that's average for this time of the year. And then winds should be similar to today. And that's talking about tomorrow afternoon. What's great is tonight, as we go into 11 p.m., 2 a.m., 5 a.m., those winds significantly calm down once again. So that's going to allow them to go direct on the fire, maybe do a couple more firing operations. And that's what's really been helping us the last couple of days is in the past, the fire was staying very active overnight because the winds were staying above 20 to 25 miles per hour. Now it looks like we're getting another great relief tonight. And then tomorrow afternoon, as you'd expect, the winds come up again. That shows 25 mile per hour gusts, but I mean, if you look, I'd say it's going to be more around 15 miles per hour. That's what we saw today. And tomorrow's forecast looks very similar to today. So where we saw some of the heat and some of the growth today, that's where I am still expecting some of the heat and some of the growth tomorrow. But I think it was Zeke Lunder who said, if the conditions aren't changing, then you can basically almost just copy and paste what happened today onto tomorrow. If you had 5,000 new acres burn. You can probably expect another 5,000 acres tomorrow. And yeah, we'll see what the new acreage is, but I don't think there's going to be any immediate threats to Butte Meadows, Mineral, Manton, or Shingletown, at least for the next day or two. And the main reason I say that is because the winds aren't as strong, and it's the strong winds that were leading to a lot of that very fast growth in previous days. Now, with all that being said, I should always emphasize, always take evacuation orders and warnings seriously. It helps CAL FIRE do their job because they don't have to worry about evacuating people. They can just protect your structures, which is probably the main reason you would want to stay around anyway. And just it's also good just to listen to what CAL FIRE is saying, listen to what the sheriff's saying. I believe his name's Corey Honey. I love watching him in the briefings. He told a story today about a couple of people who tried to come in and do some looting, and they got them, and now they're in jail, and I think they even had some drugs on them too, so they're going to have charges for that as well. And Corey Honey even said the line, he said, "Play stupid games, win stupid prizes." So Butte County, pretty lucky to have a sheriff who's looking out for you as well as Corey is, just keeping your guys' community safe. So before I wrap it up, I'll just do a brief forecast for the long range. So we looked at tomorrow's forecast. It's going to be hot, relatively dry once again, but as long as the winds aren't a huge factor, I'm not too worried about this fire, especially when we have 5,500 personnel on it. And then if we look at the long range, basically what's happening is the trough that cooled us down this weekend is moving off to the east, and then what's going to take its place is this big high pressure that's going to sit over the west. And a high pressure spins clockwise, so what that's going to do is bring in some warmer, more I shouldn't say, warm air usually dries you out. So as things get hotter through Thursday, you'll most likely see relative humidity drop down slightly as our temperatures go from below average, which they were today, to as we get later into the week, as we get into Thursday, you see a bit more of that orange showing up on the map, which means we're going to transition back to above average temperatures. So as that happens, things are going to get a little hotter, a little drier. But usually when a high sits over the west, you have relatively calm winds until that high starts to exit. Now, one thing that is going to happen though, and this is important, that is pulling up this air from the south, pulling up from the Gulf of Mexico, is it's also going to pull in some moisture as we get into Friday and Saturday. So what that's potentially going to do is see it move in right there. That could bring the threat of some thunderstorms as we get into Friday and Saturday. Although I don't know if I should say threat, because I've seen thunderstorms work both ways on fires. Sometimes it can bring rain and actually help out the situation. Sometimes it can bring gusty, erratic winds and actually lead to some more erratic growth. And then obviously the concern with thunderstorms is if we're drying out throughout the week with above average temperatures over the next few days, the fuels get even drier, and then thunderstorms could lead to lightning, which leads to some new fire starts. So that's just something on the horizon that I'm going to be thinking about. Again, with thunderstorms, it's kind of a wild card. Sometimes it's good for wildfire, sometimes it's bad for wildfire. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens there. But overall, although we do have a lot of heat on this northeastern side of the fire right now, amazing work being done by CAL FIRE, and feeling a lot more confident about this fire than I was in previous days. So I'll continue to do updates. I'll do another one tomorrow morning and then another one tomorrow afternoon if the situation seems to be picking up again. But yeah, just thoughts and prayers go out to everybody who's been impacted by this fire. I don't want to make it seem like it's going to be over anytime soon. Sometimes fires like this, especially where we have dry, abundant fuels, can go on for, in some cases, weeks. So it could be a marathon, not a sprint, but it at least looks like conditions are much improved from where we were last week. So hopefully everybody can sleep a bit better tonight. I know I will. And hopefully this video was helpful. Thanks for watching.